Well, welcome everybody. This is our fourth keynote and our final keynote of the conference. So it's my privilege to be able to introduce Dr. Marco Barker. He is our Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion at UNL and has been with us in that role since almost exactly 2 years ago in April 2019. As a bit of background, he earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Arkansas as a fellow Arkansas alum. I'll have to say, go Hogs. He also earned a Master of Business Administration from Webster University and a doctoral degree in Educational Leadership and Research from Louisiana State University. He's previously served in diversity leadership roles at Westminster College, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and at Louisiana State University. In his most recent role before coming here to work with us, he was at Westminster College as the inaugural Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the college's Chief Diversity Officer. But first, before we get to the Q&A, we'll get to see him deliver his recorded presentation titled Framing Critical Leadership During a Critical Time. Thank you, Dr. Barker.
Hi, well, I first want to thank the conference planning team for inviting me to be part of your experience today, and looking forward to having this conversation about critical leadership during a critical time. Again, my name is Marco Barker, Vice Chancellor for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And I thought, what such a befitting title that I think for many of us, we do find ourselves in a critical time in our country where we have been forced to think about and face a pandemic, face a greater call for racial justice, and certainly all of the different ways that it has impacted lives. And those impacts on lives absolutely have implications for health. And I think what better group to be engaging about what critical leadership can look like. And so I hope to leave some tools with you, today. And so as we have this conversation, I will be in and out and being visible in some cases and then not, so that you can fully see the information that I'm sharing with you today. And so I wanted to frame my conversation using this quote from Bell Hooks. I think is really fitting. And I'll just read it for those of you who may not be necessarily right at your screen. There must exist a paradigm, a practical model for social change that includes an understanding of ways to transform consciousness that are linked to efforts to transform structures. And this particular quote, I think is really important because it drives home this importance of having a level of consciousness, I would also say understanding and education and knowledge, and how we must have this in order to really see change happen, right? So we want our structures that may be, whether consciously or unconsciously, creating barriers for communities, that we want those to be able to be transformed. And to do that, we do have to have a higher level of thinking, or a deeper level of thinking, that calls for us to be much more critical in our leadership. And this work is certainly important, right? So when we think about why do we address bias and systemic racism, again, I know that as individuals who are thinking about health disparities, this is probably a no-brainer for you, but I thought I would just, again, frame our conversation starting with this. And I would start with this pyramid of hate that is developed by the Anti-Defamation League. And I think it speaks to, right, how something that we may be considered unseen or innocent or light can have truly have a definitive outcome and a fatal outcome. And so oftentimes what we understand as discrimination or hate often begins with just an attitude. It begins with an idea that can be a stereotype, that can be some preconceived notions. It can also be affiliated with just, we like to be around others who are like us, right? So this ideal about being able to justify biases with people that think like us. And so these are often just attitudes. Sometimes we don't express them, and they're just feelings and thoughts that we hold. And so we sort of keep those more internal. At the point that those actually begin to become more public, right, is when we start seeing this behavior around bullying or avoidance, or in most recent cases with the anti-Asian hate sentiment, slurs, and epithets begin to happen. It may be also people just excluding individuals from opportunities, right? And so these are, again, more public expressive acts that begin to happen. Cases, they're also described as discrimination, but in this particular model, they're described as plainly as acts of bias. The point that these acts then turn into creating barriers to particular systems is when we start talking about discrimination, right? So these acts then, so when someone is avoiding or excluding or ignoring to the point that it then creates a barrier to access to income. It also begins to create negative education outcomes, right? And so this is when discrimination begins to take place. So again, we've started with this, what is just considered a thought or thoughts, then moving into having these real outcomes around discrimination, which then begins to play into or lead to racism. And this is a case where, again, there are practices or policies, and these are practices and policies that certainly can take place within organizations or parts of systems, right? So this can be a particular practice. It can be for those who are in academia. It can be a department. It can be the institution. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be this overarching large organization, which absolutely, again, universities are also systems. But then what happens is when this discrimination then leads to different outcomes for different racial groups, then this is where we have racism playing out. In this particular case, structural racism playing out. We also know that racism is tied to whiteness, which I don't necessarily go into today, but understanding that part of the ways that this discrimination works is that there is some right answer, or there is individuals that are being excluded based on some sort of principles, again, or practices or policies that are oftentimes tied to ways in which whiteness makes it okay or makes it normalized, right? So for example, we're talking about economic discrimination that can be identified in credit scores, right? So who says what's a good credit score? Who says what's the proper way to interview? Who says this, right? Who says what goes into a textbook? And so these are often centered into whiteness, as a way to, again, center and normalize what is of value, or what is the norm. What we do know is that discrimination can absolutely lead to violence. And whether it is racial violence or gender violence, again, it is often rooted into an identity, but that violence we know can have, again, drastic outcomes and fatal outcomes that we've seen quite a bit in terms of again, the murder of Black and brown folks, the murder of trans individuals, the attack on those who are vulnerable, attack on those who are differently able or part of the disability community. So again, there are a number of ways that this plays out. But again, this is all stemming from attitudes. And so that's why it's so critical and why it's so important that we are being thoughtful and mindful. What I appreciate is that the American Public Health Association has identified racism as a public health crisis. This absolutely has also happened at more local levels of governance and administration. And so even our own Lancaster and Lincoln Board of Health has also identified racism as a public health crisis, because what I know, and what I know that all of you know even more, is that these particular acts have a way, again, this discrimination has implications for health outcomes. I mean, particularly when you start thinking about the social determinants that are part of public health practice. And so this is a model that I took some text from the CDC as they have outlined in the ways in which these systems and discrimination in these systems have negative impacts on individuals as they engage in these spaces when we start talking about COVID-19 and the pandemic. We know that there's absolutely discrimination in criminal justice systems when we start talking about school to prison pipeline, we start talking about mass incarceration. When people who are mass incarcerated, who have quality access to healthcare, who does not, we know that a good portion of COVID cases spread rapidly in prisons. And so again, it's one example of how there are connections to again, these health outcomes. And then these other areas. So whether we're talking about healthcare access and utilization, talking about insurance and premiums and the type of insurance that individuals can have and taking advantage of those, being able to shop for insurance or not having that option. So again, these are all aspects of how individuals decide how they're going to utilize healthcare, and also just having trust of the healthcare system is another historical issue that many communities of color absolutely wrestle with, and has to be a part of thinking through how these things get addressed. With occupations or work settings, thinking about who are identified as essential workers, and there being a disproportionate amount of communities of color who are often essential workers on the front lines, and their risk being at health, but also being able to have the flexibility to work from home, whether or not that is, because we know that individuals that are unable to, you then run the risk of losing housing, right, which is another social determinant in terms of quality to healthcare, that if you are worried about whether you're getting evicted or facing homelessness, that will have a direct impact on whether or not you're trying to make time to even think about how you take care of your health, right? Because there are more drastic and more urgent needs that you have related to housing. And then what we know about education, income, and wealth, there is a connection and correlation that researchers have found between education, attainment, and income. And so individuals who've been able to get access to higher education, access to college degrees, we know end up reporting higher income, while there are still disparities that exist, and I'll share that just a bit. And then we also know about wealth, that economists have found that wealth, that true wealth, right, is actually inherited. And so it's passed down. And so we know that histories of exclusion, that you're going to have communities of color that may not have the same access to wealth in the same way that whites may have. And so they, again, create these disparities, and then being able to have the resources to be able to take care of yourself, right? It's also a real detriment. And so people are thinking through whether or not the few resources that I do have, do I use that to be able to get the highest quality healthcare, or even to be able to get access to the highest quality healthcare. When we think about individuals who are located in rural areas and their access to healthcare and what they have to rely on. And so, as an example, again, I won't go through all of these, but you can see at a very high level, right, that there are disparities. Again, looking at outcomes. So when we go back to that definition about discrimination, and then racism is about when there are different outcomes for different populations. And we see that here, that those who identify as Black are identified in orange in the majority of these graphs. And so we can see some clear disparities. We can also highlight that in some cases, there are disparities with American Indian, Indigenous communities, Native American communities, as well as Hispanic, Latinx, and Chicanx communities as well. And so again, whether we're talking about employment, education mobility, arrest rates, and particularly around marijuana usage, it's a huge topic. And then looking at the intersection. So when we're talking about demographics, and part of doing racial equity work is that we have to make sure that we are disaggregating. And so being able to look at even earnings. And we know that, and we know it's been proven that women earn less than men in the workplace. And then when we further, again, disaggregate that, we see that Black women and Hispanic Latinx women even make less compared to white women. So we just can't stop at one particular data point, that we have to, again, be able to dig deeper and look at some of these intersections, because what we know about Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, that women of color absolutely face multiple and intersecting forms of oppression and discrimination as it pertains to their experiences. Lastly, a lot of these conversations around race, we know, came from just the ongoing, even more visible evidence of individuals, particularly black and brown folks, dying at the hands of police. And so while this points to how we think about whether we're talking about the criminal justice system more broadly, or incarceration, or community policing, that while it's in that context, it does again have these broader implications that this is again connected to a larger system. And so so we cannot remove ourselves and says, oh, I don't work in law enforcement, that's not my concern. It is, however, again, connected to this larger system that creates these disparities and is part of this larger conversation as it relates to the well-being of individuals. So as one example that I thought I would provide, and this is a profile of African-American woman who her highest degree earned is a high school diploma. She spent 27 years working in a local factory doing packing and lifting boxes. However, she's still not quite yet 60. So she said she's under the age of 60. And based on company policy, even though she's worked there for 27 years, which is a long time for anyone, she's still unable to retire until she turns 60, which I think she has about, let's say she has about 3 more years before that. The factory leadership is primarily white and male. She's earning $9.50 per hour. She suffers from chronic back pain. The company then, as part of their system, referred her to a company doctor that ruled out that her back issues were not related to the job, that she spent 27 years packing and lifting boxes. And then there's a family legacy of high blood pressure, and she's been diagnosed with high blood pressure. The community only has one dedicated grocery store, and it's not organic, and they don't sell organic items. And they also have higher prices compared to other grocery stores that are 30 to 45 minutes away. There is a Walmart in the area that has some groceries that provide some sort of cost-effective way to obtain groceries. She's already been diagnosed with cancer, 2 different types of cancer. One of those have returned, in which she has to now undergo even more chemo treatments and additional surgeries. And there's not a specialist in the town. So she has to travel at least an hour to actually see an oncologist and other specialists. And then her age and the nature of her diagnosis has not allowed her to qualify for federal assistance in particular, in terms of financial support. What I also did not mention here is that her insurance premiums, and so she has a number of bills that have piled up over time because her insurance does not pay a great deal for her surgeries or hospital stay that she's had as a result of the surgeries. And there could be a number of environmental factors as well in her small town. And so if we started thinking about some of these systems and how they are set up to, again, how they're intersecting, but also creating just really what is an exhaustive list of hurdles to overcome, we absolutely get this picture of how minority health disparities end up happening, right? So somebody has to have a level of resilience. And I know this firsthand because this particular person is actually my mother. And so I've had a chance to experience and witness firsthand how she has had to navigate just being able to figure out what solutions and to visit doctors and to do that in a way, being able to get help. And some of her treatments are intense, and she has to find someone else to go with her because she has to travel at least over an hour away. And so again, I think that we have to think about what is happening in these larger systems to create these barriers. As another example, I thought that I would share this video that has a voiceover from former or past President Kamara Jones of the American Public Health Association, and providing some insight into how we think about some of these disparities and what's needed. And so let's hear from her.
I'm Dr. Kamara Phyllis Jones, past president of the American Public Health Association. You may have heard the saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. When it comes to health and well-being, preserving health is always best. But there's more to the story. Imagine that someone is walking along and whoops, they have just fallen off the cliff of good health. And if that were you, you'd be relieved to find an ambulance at the bottom to speed you on to health care. But what else can we do to protect you? How about a net to catch people? But nets have holes, so some people may still fall through, and the net is likely to rip over time. What else can we do? Clearly, we need to build a fence at the top of the cliff to keep people from falling in the first place. But if a lot of people are near the edge of the cliff, even a really strong fence will not be enough. To keep everyone safe, we need to move all the people away from the edge of the cliff. We do that by addressing the drivers of poor health that go beyond our genes and beyond our personal behaviors. Things like low wages and under-resourced schools and unsafe housing. The environments in which we live, work, and play shape our health. These are the social determinants of health. These things can either propel people toward the cliff's edge or keep them at a safe distance from it. But this cliff analogy is incomplete. We need to also realize that the cliff is really three-dimensional. And then, to notice that resources and people are not evenly distributed along this cliff. At some parts of the cliff, the ambulance at the bottom may have a flat tire. Or maybe there's no ambulance there at all. Maybe there's no net, nor fence. And usually, at those parts of the cliff, the people are being pushed closer to the edge. These are the differences that lead to health disparities in a population. Differences in the speed and quality of the ambulances represent differences in quality of care. Differences in the presence of ambulances, nets, or fences, these represent differences in access to care. And differences in the distance to the edge of the cliff represent differences in the opportunities and exposures and stressors that make some people and communities sicker than others. We need to ask a lot of questions. Why is the cliff three-dimensional? Why do some parts of the cliff lack ambulances or nets or fences? And why are some people being pushed closer to the edge? It's because our economic system fails to provide an even playing field. It's because racism, which is foundational to our nation's history, is still with us and continues to cause profound harm to us all. And because discrimination against people of color, women, immigrants, the LGBTQ community, poor people, and others holds back our nation's health and well-being. Everyone should have the opportunity to achieve good health. If we try to address the social determinants of health without tackling these bigger systems of structured inequity like racism and sexism, we risk moving some people away from the cliff's edge, but not others. We risk making health disparities worse. Experts at the Urban Institute are exploring how local, state, and national policies have gotten us to this point, and what policy solutions inside and outside the healthcare system can drive fundamental improvements in health and well-being for everyone. We can all play a role. We can support our kids' teachers. We can participate in neighborhood cleanups. We can volunteer with community organizations. And let's recognize and dismantle racism, sexism, and the other big systems that assign value and structure opportunity in ways that undermine some groups more than others but hurt us all. Doing so will radically improve health and well-being for everyone by creating the conditions all of us need to have the best health possible.
So how do we begin to create spaces that do lead to the best health outcomes that are possible that Dr. Jones talked about? And so there are some different frameworks that I'm going to share with you today that have been helpful in terms of my own leadership, but also a way to look at the world that I think can also provide you with different lenses to make sense out of what you're seeing, but also to respond. And so one model that I've utilized is the inclusive excellence model. And this model really hinges on the belief that to truly have success, to truly be an effective organization, we have to be thinking about inclusion, that inclusion is part of that, and that goes hand in hand, that the most successful organizations are those who are practicing inclusion. And so there are different aspects of this. So there are three major components in thinking about inclusive excellence. One is we have to be able to define and understand what diversity is. In this particular case, we define it as differences, whether that be individual or group or social differences. Oftentimes we talk about group and social differences because we tend to have pretty good individual differences represented within our organizations, within our spaces. And we spend more time talking about group and social differences because context often shapes those, right? And so we're able to see who's represented in the space and who's not, what voice is missing. And so that this really helps guide our perspectives. And so again, these notions of group and social differences is one that we spend quite a bit of time talking about. However, there are many, many, many ways that people are different from, again, from personality and life experiences to these other ones that often get associated with diversity. And so diversity is this very broader term, but understanding that we have to be able to have very specific conversations about very specific group and social differences because of some of the crises that exist around us, right? If we then elevate this, right, and we say that we completely understand that understanding and recognizing these differences are core to our organization, we have to be mindful about then what does it look like to have those differences be part of shaping your organization. And whether we do that it has to be ongoing, continuous work and having those different representations of diversity. And for us, it's our curriculum and co-curriculum. For you, it may be in your research, or it may be in, again, your classrooms or in your practice. It's certainly across our intellectual, social, cultural, and geographical communities that we all comprise. I would say that the really critical piece of this is that when we are practicing inclusion, there are several things that are happening. So we're increasing our knowledge or our awareness. We're also thinking differently and more critical, right? So our thinking has become more sophisticated and we're practicing empathy. And I often tell members of our community that to really have true empathy, you have to understand communities. Otherwise, your empathy could feel and could be surface level if we don't have a rich understanding about other communities and about others. And so we have to be able to, again, do some of this greater awareness, again, to have this deeper empathy, and that all of this that is happening, right? So the diversity of individuals in different communities, going through these processes of having greater awareness and thinking critically about these environments and these communities, all of this is happening in complex ways, right? And that they are interacting with systems, and in some cases are responsive to systems and institutions or organizations. And so if we then move into, okay, so we understand inclusion is this active ongoing engagement and thinking about these issues, we cannot forget about that many of our organizations and these systems are grounded in historical treatment of populations. And we know that historically there was an effort to exclude and segregate others. And so we know that there are populations that are historically underrepresented. and have not had equal access because of this history. And so for us, we think about then what are the programs or interventions or efforts that we begin to close gaps that are a result of not the individuals, but the system itself that we have to address. So equity is a part of doing that work. So if you then all these jointly together, so thinking about diversity, thinking about how inclusion then plays out, and being able to try and achieve equity, that if we think about this work and every single thing that we do, from our mission to our operations to all the functions of our organizations, if we're always thinking about this and having this in mind, then we are practicing inclusive excellence. Because the end goal, right, as it has here, is to have and lead to well-being of democratic culture, which essentially is ensuring that every single person has the opportunity to participate and to thrive and strive. And so we want to make sure, again, that in all of our practices, again, for us, that's learning and teaching and research. For you, maybe people development, our engagement, it may be providing customer service, again, if you're a practitioner, but that all of this has to be done with diversity, inclusion, equity in mind. So again, this is just one framework that you may find helpful. Another one that we certainly know has had some contention with our previous president around critical race theory, or CRT. And there were a lot of conversations about issues or challenges with CRT. I'm a critical race scholar. For today's conversation, I won't use the theory, right? So if you may be part of an organization where you're not using this theory, there are terms, right, that are listed here that I think are extremely important as you're thinking about practicing critical leadership that is so key to doing this work. One of those is that racism is part of America's past and present. And we often say that racism, again, is in the past and we should live for today, but we have indications, right, in both outcomes and people's actions. If we go back to that pyramid of hate, we have evidence that racism is still very much part of today. And so we have to keep that in mind as a critical leader, so that when people say they are experiencing racism, we believe them, because we know that it is absolutely present today. Another notion or another aspect of CRT that is critical is often in some cases called colorblind. There's other pieces about race neutrality, and Ibrahim Kendi talks about this and how to be anti-racist. And when he begins to talk about that, there is no such thing as being race neutral, right? That all of our decisions, our policies, our practices lead to outcomes, and either those are equitable across race or inequitable. And so we have to measure it and look at those outcomes to be able to determine on what side of the equity scale are we. And so that we cannot, and even though we try to devise some way to ensure that things are fair and they are objective, that in essence, they do have some sort of, and can have some sort of outcome, especially given how they're structured. We hope it's a positive outcome, again, that racial equity is achieved, but we have to be able to measure that to ensure that we've not rested on being race neutral and then keeping ourselves from actually measuring and looking at what the outcome of our actions have been. Another item of CRT are counter stories, counter narratives. Again, this challenges us to be able to recognize that even though we think something is working well, we have to make space to hear stories that are counter to what we may think is happening, right? So whether we're talking about the vaccines right now, right? And that if there are communities of color who are saying they are either not getting the vaccines, that we have to take time to listen, because what we understand to be the narrative may not be the full picture. And so we have to ensure that we are hearing from communities of color and hearing their stories about what they perceive. Because again, even though we think we may be doing a great job and that we are doing research that is inclusive, or that we've done proper outreach and engagement with communities, that while we may think that we're doing that, communities may be telling us different. And we have to be able to say, if they're telling us different, then that's their reality. And it means that there is a disconnect that we have to examine. The last one, which connects to this idea about race neutral, is that we also need to understand that meritocracy does not equal equality. So we cannot, again, have these objective measures and say that, okay, everyone's had an opportunity, we're going to set these same guidelines. As long as everyone meets them, we've achieved and we've eliminated inequity. That is not the case because of just the complexity, right? So going back to the inclusion definition, the complexity in which racism plays out and systemic racism operates is that merit only works when every single thing is equal. And what we again know about systems is that there is so much inequity across systems. And so there's no way for everything to be equal. And so it makes meritocracy as a concept, it absolutely challenges that notion of relying on merit. Another way that you can think about your leadership. So these frameworks, whether it's inclusive excellence, whether it's critical race theory, there are a number of other critical theories that are available that absolutely can serve as a way to guide your thinking. Black feminist thought, queer theory, again, a number of other theories. I thought what I would introduce is that those are really good knowledge base and good in ways to frame. When we start to take a look at our actions and how they are having an impact and then do some sense making or make sense out of what we're seeing, these lenses developed by Bowman and Deal really provide a great way to do that. And they essentially say that there are these 4 lenses by which to understand and make sense out of organizations. And across these can absolutely intersect. And the way that they've been the most useful for me is that I think through that in any particular instance, we may think one thing is happening when in essence, something else may be playing out, or that it is more complex than just thinking or looking at it through one lens or one frame, right? So for example, we may think, okay, we want to create racial equity. And so the issue is this process. If we just change this process, then that's going to help. When in essence, what we're doing may still look wrong by other people, right? So we bring in this symbolic lens, there may be something that people are seeing that they still don't trust. And so just being able to change a process or enact a process or procedure doesn't necessarily lead to the end outcome of having people engage, because again, what's communicated or what people see may be problematic. In the same way, we may have an issue where you think, okay, if I just have the conversation with someone, that's going to be the end of it, and that's going to take care of it. And so we think, okay, I'm going to have this conversation. And so we look at it and we feel it's a human resource issue, and we've gone through this and be able to do that. When in essence, the person you may be talking with, there may be a power dynamic that makes it difficult for that person to open up. And so maybe they didn't share everything in that particular meeting. And so the political frame or the political lens is another way to really think about it, that if there is a power dynamic, how do we eliminate that power dynamic that then allows people to truly share? And so again, I just encourage you to think, to really think about these. And again, most of them intersect. Another way is for tying all of these together, I would say, is that, again, if you think about the structural, human resource, political, and symbolic lenses as a lens, as an eye, right? That you have a base of knowledge, right? So you have your own, whether it's inclusive excellence, thinking about frameworks and concepts and what you know about social determinants and other factors and terms, and data is going to be really important. I'll stress it in just a second, but data, histories of particular places. So all of these are in your toolbox, in your knapsack, in terms of having resources and places to pull information, to pull knowledge. That's really important. You still have to always be analyzing and seeing what's playing out. And again, these frames allow you to say, okay, it may not just be a structural issue of realigning someone, but it may also be something, it may also be political. Maybe there's another faction of people who think differently and they are always countering what this person is saying. Or maybe their experience is rooted in, no matter how much you promote them, if they're walking to a building where there are pictures on a wall of people who don't look like them, that can be creating an effect that no matter what you do, whether structurally or within the human resource lens, it's still a problem. And so it's that level of building your knowledge, doing sense making, that then moves you in this real critical leadership activity or this critical leadership strategy. And again, having these critical frameworks helps us give you the language. And also it helps you to identify through these lenses where things are manifesting, right? So you can see, okay, I can see where there can be discrimination or inequity in some of our policies, or I can see where there can be a power dynamic that's making it difficult, or I can see that in our traditions and our histories where there has been exclusion, and I can make sense out of that now. And so this is how, again, all of these begin to work together. So in our last time together, I want to transition into talking about strategies for leaders. And through this process, I think it's really important to be thoughtful about that these are not fail-safe. They are not the end goal. I'm often sometimes hesitant to provide strategies because this work and being critical and following and practicing critical leadership does take an ongoing practice. Or if you are committed to anti-racism, it is an ongoing practice that never ends, just in the same way that the inclusion definition talked about active, ongoing, continuous engagement. This work has to be continuous. And so it feels like exhausting. It's because it can be, because we do have this larger system that we're trying to address. But I do want to provide some sense of what you can do. Hands down, education is such a really important step, and education that helps you both understand what is happening, but also do some self-reflection and introspection. And so, and understanding concepts, not just diversity, equity, inclusion, I think those are important, but also some of these deeper critical issues. So understanding intersectionality and what that means, and decolonization and native erasure and universal design, like understanding these concepts will go a long way in helping you, again, to be able to make sense out of what you are seeing. And again, and to have a language to be able to use even as you're making decisions and working with others. And so your influence is also really important. Again, those of you may have different levels of influence or scopes of influence, whether you are, maybe you're a director of a center, or you're a department chair, or maybe you're a graduate student, maybe you're an undergraduate student. And so your influence is going to look different. But wherever you are, being able to identify where you can bring in some of these terms, have some of these conversations, frame some of these terms as concerns in your particular spheres of influence. I think in doing this work, what I also urge, again, is this notion about deficit, right? And the sense of, oh my goodness, we have to help these people, or and moving away from that these issues are systemic, and because they are systemic, it's us, right? So it's the structures, it's the institutions, or it's the programs that then need to think about how it begins to shape and change, which is not easy. I think this, in addition to this notion about power, this next strategy can be very difficult for organizations, because it does call for this self-critique that we're not as very easy to go, we operate great. It's them, right? It's people. It's these people. That's the issue, right? They just are not a good fit, or they can't figure it out, or they didn't do something. And so we have to really shift our language from that and looking at that it is on the organization to think about how it can address. And sometimes the organization may not have been as complicit in creating a system, but they are part of the system and can play a role, again, within its sphere of influence of how to try and dismantle some of these and really eliminate some of these barriers. Power is also important. In theory, some leaders like to think of themselves as collaborative and open-minded. But even again, depending on your role, there can still very well be a power dynamic. And sometimes it is structural. Sometimes it's the scope of work that makes it a power position. In other cases, it's the social capital that someone has. So maybe someone's a long-standing person and they know a lot of people. And so they have this sort of social power. But being able to recognize that there are some advantages, right? So these power dynamics give you advantage, whether you want it or not, or whether you ask for it or not, or recognize it or not, but give you some advantage. And so how then do we create this sense of shared power and bring others in that can be part of, again, dismantling these structures? One of the questions I often pose to people is thinking about who's in the room. And then do we have perspectives from different communities, especially if we're talking about issues or topics or practices or policies that impact those particular communities, that we have to, in some cases, relinquish some of our power. I mean, it's very easy to get in a room and make decisions yourself, or have your small circle of decision makers or the leaders and make these decisions. It does take more work to create space to hear from others, and it takes more time. And so being able to invest that is extremely important when we're talking about strategies around critical leadership. Resources is another. You just have to be willing to invest. There's no way around it. And so it calls for the conversation about maybe there are different ways that we prioritize monies that we're very accustomed to. And so prioritizing it for diversity, inclusion, equity work, or for anti-racism work or racial equity work is going to feel strange, because that's just not what we typically do. It's not considered a priority item that we would ever cut somewhere else. So we would never cut our technology budget, or we would never cut our personnel budget. And so, however, if we are committed to racial equity, we do have to identify that it does call for an investment to be able to do that. In the same way, making sure that you are appreciating members of your community who are bringing their unique experiences, backgrounds, and talents to the workplace, and so that you don't take advantage of your human capital. Being careful. I can't stress data enough. Data is so critical. I mean, it is one of the cornerstones of doing anti-racism work and being able to understand, so where are the differences, and how disparate are they? And so assessment allows you to do that and identify what those disparities may be. I shared earlier about just aggregating the data and looking at both intersections of race and gender identity. They can even be race, gender identity, and disability. So again, different ways of looking at that data is so important. And the last area, which connects back to the resources, is about being able to prioritize anti-racism equity as a major endeavor of your organization. And being able to do that unapologetically is really key, so that there is a sense that there's going to be a culture shift that can happen. And so there has to be this, we're prioritizing it and we're communicating it broadly and clearly that we are committed to focusing on equity, or focusing on anti-racism, or focusing on both, right? That is the level of engagement that really has to happen. And so at this time, I am more than happy to take your questions.